Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this short follow-up presentation, we're going to finish our conversation about experiments. We're only going to focus on a simple example, and I leave it to you to incorporate this example into your thinking and consider how you could apply this in much more complex situations. So let's imagine that your lifelong dream has been to open an Asian noodle restaurant. You've done a little bit of background checking on this, and you've discovered that the estimated cost to open a restaurant in Madison would probably run just about $500,000. Now, there's lots of ways that you might obtain that kind of capital. Perhaps you're independently wealthy. Perhaps you have wealthy family members who are happy to fund your entrepreneurial experiments. But on the other hand, it is also possible that you don't have access to that kind of capital, or you simply aren't sure that it's a good idea to make that kind of investment at this point in time. And so the idea here would be to use lean startup thinking to run experiments to make sure this is going to work before you put that kind of capital into it. And so we're very briefly going to talk about 4 pieces of this lean startup approach: doing some online research, talking a little bit about interviews, the concierge theory, and then a prototype. So we'll begin with a little bit of online research. There are many tools online that you can use in order to try to determine whether or not a particular idea is feasible. So in this particular situation, the question you're really interested in is what type of noodles should you be focused on? And you've selected 3 noodle types that you think there simply aren't enough options out there: ramen noodles, soba noodles, and pho noodles. And so one very simple tool that you can use is Google Trends. And if you've never used Google Trends before, then I strongly recommend checking it out to see, because it's highly entertaining. There's all sorts of fun things that you can look up. It's free, and you can do comparisons. And so here is, you can see on this slide, the result of a simple trend search comparing pho, soba, and ramen noodles. And basically all this is measuring is how often do people search for these topics. Now, the numbers on the side are not an absolute number, they're relative numbers. They're simply a way for Google to give you an idea of how interest in these topics is changing over time. And so you might come to a couple of conclusions. The first conclusion is that soba is going to be a challenge. There's just not that many people in the United States are searching for soba noodles. The second conclusion, that pho and ramen actually not that far apart. But broadly speaking, in the United States, ramen is searched for more often. And so if we were thinking about how viable this idea is, this would give us a sense that of the various types of noodles, the ramen seems to have the most search interest, which suggests that there might be more customers for it. But this is a pretty broad search specific to the United States. What if we wanted to think about this just in Texas? Well, the beauty of this is that Google cheerfully provides that information as well. There's many different ways to filter this kind of search, but one of them is simply by U.S. state. And here are the results for Texas. And you might notice something a little bit different, which is that, broadly speaking, over time, pho has actually been searched for more often in Texas than ramen. Now, that's not to say that you might not decide still to do ramen, especially towards the end. They're much closer, and there's some indication that there perhaps now is more interest in ramen. But if we were doing this even a year ago or 2 years ago, we might have come to the conclusion that pho was a more attractive option if we were opening our restaurant in Texas. So this is just a simple example of how you can do very basic online research. There's many, many other tools and mechanisms you can use in order to get background information about markets, market segments, but Google Trends is a really nice basic way to start. So the second thing we might do is then try to do some interviews. So let's imagine that we have settled on Texas. We have decided that we're gonna abandon soba for the moment, and we're going to go to, say, UT Austin and talk to 25 college students. I don't know exactly how you might choose to do that. You could probably just put up a little table in the middle of one of the high traffic areas and simply, speak to people. Perhaps you have direct connections. You could try to do an online survey, but be careful about the data from online surveys. Here are some good questions you might ask. How often do you buy Asian noodles? What type do you generally buy? Where do you prefer to buy them, and so on. Here's a really problematic question. Would you buy soba noodles at a restaurant? So the difference between these first questions and this last question is the first questions are asking them about their past or current behavior, And this last question is asking them to predict the future. And when we do interviews and ask people to predict the future, we usually get data that's not very helpful. And there's all sorts of biases that come into play when people answer questions like this. One of the biggest ones is called social desirability bias, and that means that we like other people to like us. And so if someone asks you a question like, would you buy soba noodles at a restaurant, even maybe you're not very familiar with soba noodles, you don't go out very often, you might have a tendency to say yes because you suspect that's the answer that they want, and you want them to like you for having said the right answer. So when we do interviews for entrepreneurial opportunities, we need to be very careful about asking people to predict their future behavior. There is extensive research in the field of psychology that shows that people are terrible at actually reporting their own interests and preferences, but they're especially bad at predicting their own future behavior. So be very, very careful about those kinds of situations. One interesting opportunity would be to do a concierge experiment, as it's described in your textbook. In this case, what we'd be doing is setting up a table in a dorm or another university building or outside. Maybe we have to get permission. Maybe we're doing this sort of on a guerrilla basis and we're just going to do it and hope we don't get in trouble. Please don't get arrested. Please don't cause yourself trouble for getting involved in these entrepreneurial experiments when you really do need permission. But you could do a whole bunch of things. You could offer small batches of food options, maybe for free or for a very small charge, and then you could observe and track the choices when college students are offered a small sample of pho or soba or ramen. Which one do they tend to choose first? Ask them questions as they're eating the food or observing the food or smelling the food. And then if at all possible, try to get their contact information for follow-up. So the idea behind this is that it's not a restaurant. It's sort of a very high cost process, but it gives you an indication of what people might actually behave like if they were presented with real purchasing choices. And then finally, you could do a true prototyping. So for example, you could set up a food cart. Now I'm talking about Library Mall, that's Wisconsin obviously, but you could do this at any university, where you have a food cart instead of an actual restaurant. So instead of a $500,000 outlay, setting up a food cart will probably cost you about $25,000. So maybe it's just yourself and a friend doing the cooking, taking the money, but this would give you the opportunity to test products and price points, right? Does there a big difference between $5 and $7? How you market it, what the cart looks like. You could try different paint schemes. And while you're there, you could capture data. You could note how popular it is compared to other food carts. What are the good times? How profitable is it? Are you actually able to make money on small portions with reasonable pricing? Do you have to do something different? How effective is marketing? What if you gave out coupons that said, bring a friend next time and they get $1 off? So this is a true prototype, right? It is almost exactly what would happen at a restaurant without the sit-down experience. And this is where you're going to get the most powerful data about what really is likely to work. Ultimately, you want to open the noodle restaurant. Before you did any of these experiments, you pretty much had no data at all. Now you have some information about what people search for. You might have information about what they're interested in or even what they actually buy. You might have good information about price points that are likely to work and marketing information that tells you what you need to say to customers. So each step in the process was an option to continue, right? If you'd done the trends analysis because your heart was set on soba and you realized that's not going to work, you could have stopped right there. When you did the interviews, if 24 of the 25 students said they'd never go to that kind of restaurant, it was another time for you to say maybe this isn't going to work. But if 20 out of the 25 said yes, we actually make noodles at home, but it would be so much better to get them done properly in a restaurant, that's another opportunity to continue. Each step in this process increases your cost and your commitment, but it also increases the fidelity of the data you're getting, how much closer you are to real data that would work for a restaurant. I love to come back to a comment that was made by a good friend of mine, Jose Estabil, who's launched multiple billion-dollar semiconductor technology products. He's been an entrepreneur and launched a couple of tech companies since then. And he always says this wonderful statement, which I love to share with students, which is, make what you can sell. Don't try to sell what you can make. In the case of our noodle restaurant, our goal is to figure out what sells, what will customers buy, and once we know what that is, let's make those. a significant number of entrepreneurs start this process by making whatever it is they've wanted to make, and then they hope to sell it. And that very often, forgive the pun, is a recipe for disaster. So I hope this has given you some thoughts about experiments, and with this example, I'm sure you can come up with other better ways of doing experiments for a variety of different kinds of products and services.